So the first lesson has to do with effort. I got interested in the story of Fleetwood Mac because I have a friend who's in the music business, and we were talking once about rock and roll bands, and we were starting to talk about Fleetwood Mac, and he said to me, "What do you think is the greatest Fleetwood Mac album?" And I said, "It's Rumours, of course, right?" And he said, "Yeah, you're right. Rumours really is, like I said before, in the history of rock and roll, that's not just one of the top-selling records of all time. I think it sold something like 29 million records, which is number 3 or 4 of all time. But it's considered one of the finest and most influential albums in the history of rock and roll." He said, "Yeah, you're absolutely right. Their best album is Rumours." So then he said, "I've got another question for you. What number album do you think that is in the history of Fleetwood Mac?" Right? If you look at their discography, what number is Rumours? And I said, "Well, I know they did that self-titled album before, and I know that they started out in England, so maybe they did an album in England before. I'm going to guess that Rumours is their 3rd album." And he said to me, "You couldn't be more wrong. It's their 15th album." Right? That story I told you, in other words, about Fleetwood Mac and the rise of Fleetwood Mac, one of the things that was so misleading about it is that I made it sound like Fleetwood Mac was some kind of overnight success. Nothing could be further from the truth. Peter Green forms that band in London with John McPhee and Mick Fleetwood in the mid-'60s. And they play in the London club scene for years and years. And all kinds of people come in and out of the band. They go through a guy named Dave Walker, Bob Bunning, Dave Spencer, Danny Kerwin. I'm listing only a handful of them. And they play and they play and they put out album after album, and they go through all kinds of trials and tribulations. At one point, Peter Green, who is their founder and leader, leaves and joins a German cult and starts to do lots and lots of LSD, and no one sees him for a couple of years. And then, he comes back for a while, and then another guy leaves and joins a German cult. I guess joining German cults was something that rockers did back in those days. Another time, the band kind of takes a time out, and they go and they rent this decrepit mansion down in the south of England called Benefolds. And they spend a year there, and their kids run around naked, and they do huge amounts of hash, and they have goats. And, the story of the band, it isn't until the early 70s that they actually go to Los Angeles. And they're in Los Angeles for a couple of years before they have that crucial meeting with Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham that transforms the band into this kind of runaway success story. Now, it strikes me that we do this all the time when we look at success stories, we kind of shrink them. We think of them as being these sort of overnight successes, and we overlook all of the hard work that goes into that kind of burst of creativity. In fact, there's a whole branch of psychology that has been, in recent years, devoted to this very question, devoted to pointing out just how much work is involved in reaching a level where you can engage in highly productive and creative and innovative work. And one of the foundational observations of this branch of psychology is something called the 10,000-hour rule. And it's something that I talk about in my book, Outliers. And the idea behind that is very simple, and that is that you can look in any number of different cognitively complex fields, and it doesn't matter where you look. You will almost always find that in order to reach the top of that field, an individual has to first put in at least 10,000 hours of practice. Now, 10,000 hours works out to about 10 years. It takes about 10 years to put in that much. So it's also the 10-year rule. And what this says is, it doesn't matter where you look. It takes 10 years to be good. So, for example, some of this research has looked at chess players. If you look at international grandmasters, what you find is that in almost every case, you have to have been playing chess in a disciplined, serious way for at least 10 years before you become an international grandmaster. There is only one real exception to this rule, and that's Bobby Fischer, the greatest chess player of all time, and it took him 9 years. Right? Another branch of this research looks at classical music composers. And what they do is they take a list of the greatest classical music compositions of all time, and they ask the question, how many years had the composer been composing when they came up with this work of genius? And in every case, you find out that the composer had been composing for at least 10 years when they did their masterpiece. And I know when you hear that, you think of, well, what about Mozart? Wasn't Mozart this incredible prodigy? Wasn't he writing music when he was 9 or 10 years old? And the answer is yes, he was. But have you ever listened to the music Mozart did when he was 9 and 10 years old? It's terrible, right? Not very good. The first real breakthrough work of Mozart's is Concerto No. 9, 271, which he composes when he is 23 years old, at which point he had been composing for nearly 14 years. Right? In other words, Mozart is not a prodigy. He's a late bloomer. Right? He's actually someone who takes a little bit longer than that 10-year window to achieve greatness. And what strikes me, what's so amazing about this is that it doesn't matter where you look. When we look at successful individuals or successful organizations, you will always see this period of intensive preparation